Notification.
It appears I have a text message.
Telegram.
Oh man. On that note, welcome to the Strength Athlete Podcast, episode 9. This is actually going to be a fun episode for us. We have all been looking forward to it, and we're going to talk a little bit about peaking for powerlifting. Our good friend and very qualified coach joining us today is going to be Brian Miner. Say hello, Brian and guys.
What's up, guys?
Hey, how's it going?
What's going on?
Brian actually has really worked hard to pick up a microphone from Radio Shack from 1997 for this podcast, and we're really excited to hear him at half volume of the rest of us. But before we get started, just some quick little shout outs. First off, LVD Fitness, again, thanks for sponsoring the podcast. They have literally made this possible for us to host our episodes. So if you want to check out what they're doing, you can find them at www.lvdfitness.com. They are donating clean water to people in need for every single item purchased. And overall, they're pretty cool people, and they actually take some nice photos at powerlifting meets as well. In addition to that, we do still have our pre-order for those t-shirts open that are helping to support the Strength Athlete team members get to Belarus this summer. It is an expensive trip. Those shirts are $25, and you can find them at thestrengthathlete.com/t-shirts, and then basically there's a nice little pop-up right there. Some good info there. You can talk to any of us about that, and we'll be happy to let you know. 100% of proceeds going towards supporting the team. Anyway, getting into the subject here, peaking. What is peaking? One of you guys want to explain it to me? I fully don't understand this.
Peaking is the process of taking an athlete and reducing fatigue that can sometimes mask fitness, and in an effort to improve fitness and get the best result for a specific targeted performance on a specific date.
So talking fitness and fatigue, how would you guys define something like overreaching?
I think first we should probably just define the key variables that are in the fitness fatigue model. So basically we're looking at fitness, fatigue, and preparedness. So fitness would basically be your positive adaptations to training. Fatigue would be the negative adaptations, just the both acute and chronic accumulations of fatigue over the course of training. And then preparedness is just your ability to express your strength at a given time. So over the course of a training cycle, what you want to do towards the end is maintain your fitness, reduce fatigue, so that your preparedness is at its peak at the end of a training cycle.
So Eric, sorry about that.
No, go ahead.
Eric, would you say that preparedness is kind of something like fitness minus fatigue?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
You literally took the words directly out of my mouth there, Bryce.
my bad, man.
No, it's okay. I thought it was funny you asked the exact same question.
I think one thing, before we move on from that, I think one thing that's important to sort of mention about that model is it's very conceptual in nature, and I think a lot of people hear the idea, fitness minus fatigue is preparedness. And, fatigue is one of the things that when we're trying to peak, we're trying to reduce as much as possible while keeping those fitness adaptations intact. But it's still very conceptual, and it's something we can't rigidly quantify. So it's a very there's no way to actually calculate how your peak. There's just a lot of moving parts to it. So on both sides of the equation. So I think that's something to sort of keep in mind. I think as listeners continue to as we sort of navigate through this conversation, is that it's a conceptual model that has a lot of variability and a lot of contributing factors to it.
Oh yeah.
It's not even the case that if you found a style of peaking that you ended up having a great performance afterwards, it's difficult to say, could I have done better? And secondly, if I repeated this exact same thing in another 12 weeks for a different competition, would I have felt the same on the platform? So peaking is not only context dependent in terms of these variables, but also time dependent. Same training cycle, maybe I have added stress because I'm waking up to feed my kid at 2 a.m. every day, or I took on a few extra classes in school, so I have kind of overall more mental load and stressors and things like that.
Yeah, it's particularly when you're talking about peaking. So many people are so highly different, and accounting for the stressors outside of your life, not specifically just training, is a place where I feel a lot of people drop the ball, and some people end up requiring a huge counterbalance in that. I've had on the very extreme side, someone like Garrett Blevins, who is doing like 3 to 5 singles a week and one trivial intensity day on the off day. And we're talking like sets with 225 pounds, 315 pounds for some sets of 5 on tempo squats, which for a 700-pound squatter is nothing. I mean, that's a warm-up set. And but he has a new baby. He works a full-time job. He's going to school. The guy probably gets 5 hours of sleep a night and somehow is mustering up his best performances. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you, Bryce, are a perfect illustration of what you just said about repeating a peak. I know that you had a series of competitions that just got better and better and better and better one after the other. And from what I understand, your training for each of those looked reasonably similar. And that was a good example of finding a peak that worked, applying it and repeating it, maybe identifying some weaknesses when you're a little further out from competition. But maybe you could have peaked better, maybe. But why fix what isn't broken?
Yeah, for me, the last 8 weeks for the last 3 or 4 competitions has been almost identical. And that's kind of served as a little bit of a psychological aid to look at the training and be like, well, this delivered me a great level of performance before, therefore it's probably going to do the same thing now. And maybe that's not the case, but it's kind of mentally reassuring to have that in the back of your head. I kind of wanted to ask you guys, when we talk about peaking, I think people get the impression that we're dealing with some mystical process that you end up getting a massive boost in performance. So I want to set the record a little bit on what kind of boost in performance we can expect with a peak. And with a peak, we're talking about taking whatever your level of strength was at 2 weeks out, 1 week out, whenever you decided to start that peak, versus the day of your testing event, either a competition or a training test. What can we expect to see in terms of increases in strength?
I think the answer to this highly depends on, number one, which lift you're talking about. And again, well, actually, let me rephrase that. This depends on your training style first and foremost. Some people deal in a high fatigue training model and thus are feeling like crap all the time. Just, if generally you're training really heavily all the time with moderate to high amounts of volume all the time, everything feels slow. Your ability to express your strength on competition day with an appropriate taper of volume and intensity is going to feel pretty substantial, something like 5 or 10% on the high end with 10. And if you're getting more than that, that's an unusual case, and it's, in my opinion, not really merit for discussion. But I would say 10% on the really high end. I've definitely seen people go from moving something like 90%, looking like absolute molasses, to moving what is 103% of their old max on competition day, or 105%, like it's nothing. And this is kind of a matter of trial and error for some, but I think that's probably an acceptable range to what to expect.
Yeah, Pritchard did a study in 2015, Hayden Pritchard from New Zealand, and basically just reviewed the tapering literature for maximizing strength gains. And the main findings were that there was basically like a 2 to 8% increase in strength from baseline, from untapered training. And I think the average of that was more towards the lower end of that. So maybe just like a few percentage points difference in terms of what you can do untapered and what you can do with a reduction in volume.
So Hani, you mentioned, the idea that sometimes 90% lifts, like a few weeks out, kind of feel like ass and just move really slow and stuff like that. We can talk a little about what overreaching is, because sometimes coaches create training programs in such a way to purposely push past the boundary of recovery with the idea that we get a super compensation and a boost in performance on the other side. That's a little bit different than peaking. Brian, can you kind of speak to the difference between overreaching and peaking a little bit?
I mean, I think with overreaching, we're essentially, if you sort of think about the fitness capacity climbing, we're trying to assertively push that ceiling as high as we can. But we have to realize with every unit of work we add in an overreaching cycle, we're going to have an incrementally greater increase in fatigue. So you sort of see that gap tend to close a little bit. So you might drive fitness up, you might drive fatigue up a little bit more, and the kind of the delta between the two, the preparedness, you may actually see go down a little bit. But that is sometimes needed for that assertive increase in that ceiling. And then when we taper, we want to then keep this up here and then pull that fatigue down, and we have a greater difference in a greater increase in preparedness. And with tapering, we don't need. You're asking the difference between overreaching and tapering.
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
So I mean, you can incorporate overreaching into a taper, but you don't need to push to the point of seeing like decrements in performance with a taper. Like conceptually, all we're looking for with a successful taper is a greater decrease in fatigue than we see fitness capacity. So like even some of the things like the research looking at taking time off from training, we might actually see that ceiling come down a little bit from detraining to a slight degree, but if fatigue drops to a greater magnitude than what our fitness capacity drops, that net difference is still going to be greater. We're still going to see a greater increase in preparedness on the day of competition. So we don't have, I think it's sort of in vogue right now for people to, I think powerlifters they think they need to feel like crap heading into a meet. It's like, okay, I want to, things need to feel terrible in order for me to then taper and see a benefit from it. And that's, I think, a big misconception. And like I said, there's a point of overreaching where we see the fatigue climb so high where we actually can't produce a significant training stimulus to maintain those fitness adaptations. And at that point, it's very non-functional in nature. And so while they can be within the same model, you don't need to overreach in order to have a successful taper and to have a net increase in performance.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, by the way. I think on the opposite spectrum, sometimes people will get into a situation where they're hitting heavy loads a week or two out, and they move slower than expected, they freak out, they don't feel that you have to push too hard, but they expected things to move better, and now they're kind of freaking out about what their performance is, when that might just be a general process of the peaking cycle. So kind of one thing I think would be cool in this conversation is if we can let people know what to expect when it comes to the last few weeks of a competition.
Oh yeah, I mean, in a real world situation where you've been, let's say, for someone who's training with us, typically on a 12-week cycle, and they've had 4 weeks of volume accumulation, 4 weeks of building up intensity, and a couple weeks of really heavy training, and we start to taper off that volume. Those initial phases where fitness and fatigue are both very high. Talking about the kind of the delta there, the difference between the two, like Brian said, your preparedness is going to be quite small, so everything's going to feel pretty crappy. And something that's kind of unspoken in that relationship is a greater propensity for making errors in actually executing the lifts. And something as simple as a minor misgroove can make an 80% squat feel like an absolute max. And not accounting for your tendency to make those errors more frequently based on how fatigued you are, and just the fact that getting all of the little bits and bobs moving in the correct direction, not being able to focus fully on that because you're because you're distracted by Bryce Lewis's laughing, it makes execution of the lifts harder, which is really a lot of what it's about too as well. It's related to your ability to express that skill and perform those lifts in the way that you've practiced and the way that you intend.
So Eric, since you've been kind of looking into this stuff, I want you to direct us a little bit here. What does the research on peaking generally say, and then peaking specifically for strength sport say? I know you mentioned Hayden Pritchard, and I think Kyle Keogh is another big researcher in that field, but what does the research say about how to taper, and then what we can expect?
Yeah, I think it's Jess and Keogh. They're both out of New Zealand. Keogh and Pritchard both work together on quite a few studies related to powerlifting. But generally speaking, for tapering strategies for powerlifting, the recommendations are to reduce volume, maintain or even slightly increase intensity, maintain frequency, and have a short-term cessation of training of maybe 2 to 4 days at the most.
So are there any bounds on how much to reduce training volume or intensity?
That's where it gets a little bit vague. It can be a pretty wide range there, and I think that's usually something that's going to be situational and more fatigue dependent. So, some person who has singles that are moving really well from week to week as they get closer to the meet, maybe you don't want to pull away too much volume for them because they're already in a pretty good spot. Whereas somebody who's really struggling, who you've been maybe pushing hard in the few training blocks leading up to that, they might need a more steep reduction in volume in order to get to that level of preparedness that we're looking for.
So I think in all these cases, what you're saying is that some type of athlete monitoring system is super important when we're close to a competition, especially to find out which of these cases an athlete's in.
Right.
Are they recovering well or performing well between sessions? Are they feeling beat up? So what kind of things would you guys track when it comes to this stuff?
Bar speeds. Follow the data, right, Brian? For those of you who don't get the joke, it was just a training session with Brian, and some fun stuff happened with the bar speed tracker. Inside jokes aren't nearly as funny now that I think about listening to them on a podcast. But bar speed is certainly an option. I actually really like using rating of perceived exertion, as I think that confidence has a lot to do with how someone's going to move a weight. And so if they perceive that they're moving it better, if they perceive they're moving it better than it looks, that's a rare occasion. But if that happens, I find that's actually a really positive situation. When that ratio switches is when I find that fatigue is kind of creeping up there.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a lot of it's athlete motivation too, and just the psychological aspect. And I think for me, a big part of peaking an athlete, especially having, if I've worked with them for a number of meets, at that point I sort of learn, like, I want them to buy into the process. And I think once they sort of understand, how fatigue can climb and how performance can sort of decrease, because I'm sure we've all worked with an athlete at some point, first meet that they've done, like the wheels have fallen off for them and they panic, 3 weeks out. And, I think it's interesting for me to see that tendency sort of decreases meet to meet. And so I look at, the more I work with an athlete, how they're feeling, like once they understand sort of fitness and fatigue relate to one another, how they're feeling in terms of confidence, knowing that relationship exists. And I think, for somebody that's been through it a few times, if they're still like, hey, I'm feeling exceptionally crappy right now and compared to a previous peak, like that's having that experience and going through multiple peaks with the athlete. It's sometimes just their perception is one of the most valuable assets that we have once they understand the model exists.
So, Brian, if you've got an athlete that you're working with and maybe you worked with them a few times, how do you separate the effectiveness of the peak versus maybe just a bad performance on the day of the competition, or like an excessive weight cut or just nerves or something like that? Because in an ideal world, we would just look at absolute performance based on this robot's ability to move a barbell, but we're dealing with actual athletes. So kind of how do you say that was a good peak, or what else is going on there?
There's a lot of like when you look at decreasing, and bringing down fatigue, like all the variables that are contributing to that, like you look at, like the big thing that I feel like doesn't get talked about enough is caloric intake and peaking. If they're trying to make weight, or if they've started that peak at a higher weight and they're trying to diet into the meet itself, like to speak to your situation, Bryce, where you've replicated the same type of peak, have you had wildly variable weight cuts throughout that period of time, or has that been constant?
No, and in fact, this coincided with the move up to 105, so there's a lot going on there. I was obviously gaining strength, gaining body weight too.
Well, sure, yeah, that's the point. But I think, like, for me, the first thing I look at is the stuff honestly outside of the training. So I look like, okay, are they in a calorie deficit? Or like, where was our energy balance heading into this meet? Where was stress heading into this meet? Where was sleep heading into this meet? Because I feel like the fatigue management side of things and the actual recovery side of the equation oftentimes play a bigger role than the programming adjustments and decreasing the stress through the training stimulus itself. And I feel like that addressing those issues first and looking at those issues first gives me a lot more insight than, like, if I know the athlete had, everything was on point, then we can really isolate and look at the peak itself and the training structure itself and establish, which was more successful than another. But, like we said at the beginning, there's so many moving parts that it makes it very difficult to isolate any one variable into, in terms of the success or the failure of a peak.
Right.
Because there's just, and I feel like it's almost, it's careless to think that we can, in a sense, because there's just so many variables that go into it. And I would be lying if I, there's been peaks where I've had with athletes where it's worked out perfectly when on paper, perhaps it shouldn't have. And then there's been peaks that have gone, everything's been great and it's the day of, for whatever reason, things just don't go to plan. And so, there's a lot of stuff, I think, as coaches, if we're being honest, that there's some things that we don't know. And there's still some mystery involved there.
On the subject of things that we don't know, Brian, I actually, it's something I've observed specifically in clients that you're coaching. You tend to use AMRAPs a little more frequently than I would, or than I know of in most of the TSA coaches. And I don't mean this necessarily in a critical way. I'm actually just legitimately curious. When you're talking, let's say, transition from week one of an intensity phase into the final week of a peaking block, what does your structure on those look like? Because the idea of peaking with uncapped AMRAP sets seems difficult to manage fatigue, in my opinion.
I agree. And that's a good question. I think the biggest thing that I try to get across with using AMRAPs is I don't refer to them as AMRAPs, mostly because I feel like that just gets people in the mindset of pushing to like an RPE 10. Like that gets people into the, like, I will oftentimes have them cap it, like, rather than a rep cap, which I do use sometimes, but I might cap it at like an 8 or a 9 RPE. Mm-hmm. And that's in terms of managing fatigue, like the difference between a 9 and a 10, or even a 9 and a 9.5 can be pretty significant. Right. So I think, with the peaking, the way I use those mostly is just in terms of like an auto-regulatory, like progressive resistance model where I'll adjust loading the following week based off of that performance. And so if somebody's very positively adapting to the stimulus and they get, 4 reps above that base number, like I know that those initial set RPEs are probably a bit lower than maybe we want. And so I can then use that to increase loading the following week. Now there's, having said that, like I agree, and to be completely honest, I'm getting away from them a little bit more than I have in the past, mostly because there's just, once the athlete is in tune with using RPE and like things like rating final set RPE, you can sort of get at the same outcome. Like the point of the plus set isn't for me as a coach, isn't to elicit like an additional training effect. It's not really for additional volume. It's to adjust loading. So if I know, if at the end of the, that set, they rate their final set at like a 7 RPE, it's safe to assume like, okay, they had 2 to 3 reps left in the tank there, and I can adjust loading accordingly. And so I think in terms of like a peaking block, that can be a very valuable tool, to still use that progressive resistance model without having to use plus sets. And I anymore very rarely use them on deadlifts, just in general. But things like bench, like I think as powerlifters, we're like people are aware of the impact of training fatigue, but I think sometimes I don't want to say we baby ourselves, but in outside of technical breakdown, like pushing to a 9 RPE shouldn't be like inherently that fatiguing. You know what I mean? Like it's not like what happens when, I think one of the problems with using them too frequently is just the increased risk of injury and like a misgroove, like you said, Hani, and it's just a greater opportunity to, like, the risk outweighs the reward, so to speak. And so, but like, I mean, you've benched, you've done daily max benching, correct?
Yes.
So, I mean, like if you were to do that, like I mean, obviously, like for you, it worked exceptionally well. The risk, like, kind of outweighed the reward there at the end of it for you. But there's been people that have done that very successfully. And like I was benching, working up to a heavy single for a while, and it did start to aggravate me a little bit. But looking back at it, a lot of it had to do with just like unracking the bar on my own. Like I feel like a lot of it is, if you can control all the variables, like pushing to high relative intensities, assuming it's not like a true RPE 10, like death grind, I don't think I don't think it's that detrimental. And I think the athlete's own perception of it can have a big impact on it as well. Like if they go into these plus sets just absolutely dreading it, then that's going to be like, that's an additional psychological stress that's imposed. And then, speaking to one of my athletes, like Jackson Spencer, I mean, he's a good example of somebody who uses that system very well, in that, like, he'll sandbag the hell out of it, but then rate his final set RPE, like, very accurately. It's like, okay, I might have got 3 more reps, but it was like at a 7. And so we can kind of know at that point how to adjust the loading the following week without him having to push. And so hopefully that sort of addressed your question. But
yeah, no, absolutely. I would like to kind of wind back a little bit in what you were saying there, and just to define a couple terms for people who are listening. Obviously, AMRAP sets, this is a term that we use pretty loosely, but for people who aren't familiar with the term, it's similar in a structured program like 5-3-1. You kind of get those plus sets at the end. So, for example, you would have a training day where your final set, you perform as many reps as possible, AMRAP, so AMRAP. And then a second definition there would be what Brian was talking about with autoregulatory progressive resistance exercise, or APRE programming. And basically what that is using progress, or rather using some gauge of progress at the end of any given training week to determine how you change loads week to week. In the case of how it was researched, generally it was done using a plus set or an AMRAP set at the end of a week. And then based on how well you performed relative to a given range, it would determine how much you added to the next week. So for example, if you had 80% for a set of 5+ reps and you performed 5, then you would use the standard 5-pound increment next week. If you performed up to 8, you would use a 10-pound increment. If you performed above 8, you would use a 15-pound increment, and you wouldn't go above 15, or there's some limit on how much you could possibly add. And essentially what that does week to week is allow you to account for differentiations in performance week to week, as well as people who are progressing at a rate faster than what you would expect or slower than what you would expect. And it's actually a really interesting way to train. Some fun Google searching and some interesting reading. There's actually some really, really easy to digest articles out there on APRE that I would highly recommend. But if you just go to Google and just search APRE or autoregulatory progressive resistance exercise, you can read about that, and it is super interesting.
And one thing to touch on in addition to that is one of the pitfalls of using that model is, especially for people that get really amped up for these sets, like we're adjusting loads that are predicated on a set that was done in like a highly excitable state. And so if Friday you like absolutely crush your plus set, and then the following Monday you go in and do squats and feel like trash, like we could be very easily overshooting the training effect there. And so it's highly contingent, I guess, on the athlete, and how they go about performing them in terms of how successful that model can be.
Absolutely, it's a high risk, high reward training model. If you can train to the program well, this is the same in any structure where you have like plus sets or ungoverned amounts of reps or weight. It's the same reason why you don't really typically give an RPE-driven program to a novice. It's because they're gonna drive themselves into the ground with it. So, a little asterisk by the use of that style of programming is that, if you don't feel that you can monitor yourself, or if you feel that every Friday you're going to get yourself super hyped up and do the long walk to get yourself, into that squat set, then it's probably not the style of programming for you. But that's an entirely different discussion for a different podcast. But I just wanted to define those terms so people aren't kind of mystified by them.
Yeah, I think the unknown of an AMRAP set can kind of add to the excitability of it, because you don't know necessarily how many reps it's going to take to get to, even if it's a capped set where you cap the RPE, you don't know necessarily how many reps you're going to complete in order to get to that range. Whereas, if you're assigned like a triplet and 8, you have a pretty good idea of the weight range to shoot for, and you know how many reps you have to execute. But if you go in thinking, man, I hope I can get this many reps with this weight, it can just add to the pressure of that set, I guess.
I'm super guilty of having done that when I was training with plus sets. I did that a lot. I'd go in with 90% for a plus, and I'd be like, I'm going to get 7 today.
I have too. I think setting goals ultimately is like a good benchmark, as long as you're willing to adjust when things don't go according to plan. And with those models, you guys hit the nail on the head that overall, perception, like a level of arousal going into it, can really affect like fatigue in the coming days. I want to, if we're all okay with it, get back in terms of peaking for a competition and ask if we can peak the lifts separately, and how to do that. So talking a little bit about how to peak, because I often see that people take their heaviest deadlift farthest out from competition, then they take their heaviest squat, then they take their heaviest bench. Is there a reason for that? Is recoverability a factor there? What are your thoughts on that? So
the way I've been structuring the majority of programs lately, and obviously there are individual differences that'll account for these, and I have one specific example that I'll bring up. But generally speaking, deadlift is the least recoverable of the lifts. And so, you can pull a very heavy deadlift, not even a max, a very heavy deadlift, and you can be someone who trains with high frequency and recovers pretty quickly, and you can still feel like crap in a week. And your next deadlift session could just feel absolutely brutal. And then you add some squat volume to that, you add a little bit of rowing volume to that, some core work, maybe you do a cardio session in the middle. All of a sudden, a week from now, you feel terrible. And so to be able to account for that additional time needed between deadlifting, let's say your opener, and actually hitting the platform at the meet is something that you have to think about very, very precisely. As well, obviously, the bench being the most recoverable of the lifts for most people, and the squat being kind of that happy middle ground, the mama bear, you might say. And so generally the way I try to plan backwards is to have the bench opener. I usually have people take the bench opener and the squat opener reasonably close to each other, and the deadlift opener just a few days earlier, usually somewhere around 5 to 7 and somewhere around 7 to 10 respectively. And obviously there are exceptions to that. One in particular, one of my guys who I've been working with for a long time, Court Severance, Bryce, you know who he is. I've been coaching Court for 30 months now, and he was all excited because I was beginning his update last week. But he has several meets in a row. Prior to his most recent meet, we would follow a little bit more of kind of what I consider a standard peak and taper for the squat, where we would hit the opener a week out. We would take something reasonably heavy 2 weeks before that, or 1 week before that, and then you would hit meet day. And every single meet he had done with me prior to this last one, he had felt exceptional on his opener day. And I mean, really, really exceptional. His opener moved at like the speed of a last warm-up on the day where we would take his opener a week out, and then he would get to his meet and always felt like crap, always. And so in his most recent competition, I said, let's shift everything forward a week with your squats. Let's just not have you take the opener a week out. Don't even take the opener at all. We'll just ramp up and have you squat on the competition on the day you would have taken your opener previously. And all of a sudden, his third attempt looks like an opener. And this is weight that he's had to grind and miss not 3 or 4 months ago. And so it's a great example to the fact, or rather a great testament to the fact that everyone's a little bit different, and it has a lot to do with a lot of different variables in his life. Court, for example, his recoverability outside of the gym is generally pretty low. He has 2 sons, and they're both very young, and so his his sleep to life ratio is obviously a little bit off from what would be considered ideal, generally speaking, and he works early in the morning and trains whenever fits. So whereas his deadlift is just super classic, he can take his opener 7 days out, 6 days out, and perform at 105% of expectation on that. And bench press, usually he's training heavily all the time, so on bench press, so he can take his opener 4 or 5 days out and be fine. I think it's largely dictated for most people based on how they train. So if you're training heavily on the squat 2 or 3 days a week, you're going to need less time or a shorter taper between taking your last heavy squat or taking your opener and actually hitting the platform, because you're going to have a faster recovery cycle because your turnover between heavy sessions is so quickly. I think the only lift where you have to be more careful with that, like I said, is the deadlift, because you just want as much recovery as possible there. There's less of a tendency for missed grooves on the deadlift, and you're relying a little bit more on feeling fully recovered and a little bit less on needing to kind of perfect that cycle and be on the perfect timing.
Guys, what about your thoughts? Like, is there anything inherently different about the deadlift that it's more fatiguing? You know, how do you order those? And then we'll get into something that Hani brought up, which I want to touch on, is openers. He has athletes hit openers a week out, and I want to talk about why that is. But first, let's get some thoughts on the ordering here.
I think with the deadlift, and Bryce, we were talking about this just last week when you came up and trained. You know, it's one of those lifts where, like, if you miss a deadlift, we were both speaking just based on our experience with our own training. If we miss a deadlift, like, it affected us, you know, for a couple weeks. Like, deadlifting just did not feel good. And I think some of that, like, some of that could be psychological for sure, but I think there's still a little bit of mystery to why I think the deadlift is so demanding. And I think part of it is there's no, like, it's all just active contraction at the bottom of the lift. Like, you don't really have, you know, elastic properties to help you out of the bottom. So, like, the neurological demands, the neurological drive required to break the floor on a maximal attempt on a deadlift is more than it's going to be on something like a squat. You know, even though, like, the total, you know, we're using similar muscle groups. And I think that's one of the reasons. But at the same time, one thing that I, you know, admittedly am not sure of is if that neurological drive should then, in theory, affect some of your other lifts as well, since it's not just all, like, peripheral in nature, if that makes sense. So I think, but oftentimes it doesn't. So there's additional components there that I don't think have fully been, you know, explored yet.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. On the surface of it, it kind of makes sense that the bench press would recover a little bit faster because we're dealing with smaller muscle groups overall. So kind of less systemic loading overall, so you can do heavy benching more frequently and recover faster from it. Eric, anything else before we continue on?
Yeah, I think the way we program deadlift in general is pretty different from the other two lifts, because usually with the deadlift you're going to see lower frequencies and lower volumes just in general compared to squat and bench. So it would make sense that the taper is going to look a little bit different for that as well. Not even factoring in the different recovery factors that go into, you know, just because you're handling heavier weights on that lift for probably 95% of people, you know, compared to their squat. So yeah, I agree with what everyone else was saying though.
Sweet. So in powerlifting competition, we have a secondary goal in peaking of being able to get enough information to create a plan on game day, you know, to decide what you want an athlete's first, second, and third squat, bench, and deadlift to be. So with that secondary goal in mind, how do you guys approach, like, data collection so that you can actually come up with some good information? We've got a lot of moving parts there. You've got an athlete doing loads that may move slower than expected. You know, you have an athlete's training background, their past meet results. How do you guys put together that plan coinciding with a peaking strategy?
Something I've been doing more and more of lately is, so again, kind of referring back to the 12-week structure that I'm usually trying to follow. At the end of, let's say, week 8 or week 9, that's kind of when we're getting towards the end of the traditional intensity block. And at that point, generally people are at a point where they're feeling pretty beat up, but generally speaking, overall they're feeling strong, and some very, very minor taper in training volume yields a pretty positive effect, at least in terms of how they're feeling in terms of recovery. And I find a good way to test out how someone has made progress at that point, just something like a single or kind of a ramp up to a single over the course of a couple weeks around an RPE between 8 and 9, depending on the lift, closer to 8 for something like the deadlift, closer to 9 for something like the bench press. Honestly, I think you could max the bench press 4 weeks out and be totally fine. But something like that, just to get a good gauge on where actual progress has been. And then generally within, you can kind of interpolate a max off of a true RPE 8.5 or an RPE 9 single. And throughout the course of the peaking block, you might anticipate another 3 to 5% in terms of performance, and essentially build your attempts around planning from that single, essentially planning backwards from that. So if for example, you hit 90, or rather if you hit, again, let's say 95% of your previous max at an RPE 8, that's generally saying you could probably triple your previous max, and you anticipate a little bit of performance increase throughout the course of a peaking block. Odds on you can probably open with something close to that weight, and maybe a little bit lighter. But I always like to plan for situations being worse than they look like they'll be. But that's just one example of how you could kind of plan from that. And I like the inclusion of some actual gauge for progress at some point, whereas a lot of other times you would just plan for some inherent amount of progress, but I like to have a better grasp on essentially where we're going to be without overworking.
Yeah, personally, I like to see somewhere around a single at 8 or even a little bit higher, and mainly because rep work isn't always going to translate over to what they're going to be able to do in competition. Especially if you look at, let's say, a female bench press, for example, they might be able to take an opener type of weight and hit it for 5 or 6 reps, something like 92%. But you go up to a second or third attempt type of weight range, and they can barely get it for a single, or maybe a double if they're lucky. But they just tend to be a lot better with rep work. So it's easier to get a more predictable numbers as far as what you're going to shoot for if you're having a relatively heavy single in there.
Yeah, I agree with everything you guys have said. For me, for some people that just aren't good at gauging RPE, like I might use some rep performance at the end of an intensity block. So say like if I use an APRE model, for example, the last week, say our base number of reps is 1 or 2, and they get a triple on that plus set. Like that's low enough reps where, depending on the athlete, it can be predictive of their 1 rep max, and depending on how far they pushed it. But as athletes become more experienced, I tend to rely more, like you guys are saying, on a top set single, like, or a double at a 9 or a single at an 8 or a 9, just because it's just more accurate. Like as Eric mentioned, the closer, the lower in reps you go and the higher in relative intensity you go, the more predictive that's going to be for a 1 rep max. One thing though that I wanted to touch on, and I think is important, for anybody that might be doing their own programming or going into their first meet, is don't plan your attempts off of the assumption of where you're going to, I guess, super compensate. Like don't just assume that that's going to be there on meet day. And even for somebody, that I'm working with early on, say their first meet, I might plan when we test their opener, I might plan their attempts based off of, like, I'll give them sort of an idea of where I think that their opener might be, like around a 7.5 RPE. And they sort of have that number in the back of their mind, but I'm planning that based off of like a fatigue state of training. That way, like psychologically, if the lifter hits it, and fatigue comes down and they absolutely smoke it, like that's only going to benefit us. Like we can go heavier from there. But if it's like, okay, I'm going to assume that this taper, or the first half of this taper before we test our opener is going to, create all this super compensatory effect for strength, and then it doesn't work. Like they're just like, shit, I just hit my opener and it felt like a 9, So it's not it's not something, I think, like just something, that psychological aspect. It's always better, or generally in most cases better, to be on the conservative end of things, especially early on working with somebody, because we know that, over time we're going to learn more about them. And if they leave the meet, like if they go 9 for 9 and all of their thirds are at a 9 RPE, like very few people walk away from that meet discouraged, like that they're not, very few people are upset that they left weight on the platform after going 9 for 9. If anything, they're generally a lot more confident. I mean, Bryce, I've like all of your meets where you've, your total has increased exponentially. Like you really haven't had any massive grinders on thirds that I can remember and, that I've seen. And I think part of that is just like breeding long-term confidence. And I think setting up your peak in a manner that's more conservative in a sense can really help attribute to that over time anyway.
As an addition to what you were saying there, Brian, and I think this is something that's actually really important for consideration, as a general rule, and obviously there are no hard rules when it comes to training or powerlifting or anything like that, aside from, the rules that are written in the books. But if you're going to estimate your 1 rep max, the lower reps you can do it off, the better. And so as a pretty solid rule that I use across the board, I try not to estimate from anything above a 3 rep estimate. So that could be something like a single with 2 in the tank, a double with 1 in the tank, an actual triple, or any number of reps lower than that. And I think anything beyond that, you start to get into the point of interpolating for reps that you don't know whether you can actually get. And so when you're talking a heavy single, calling that an RPE 7, it might look and feel like it, but you don't know what's going to happen in those next 2 reps. And in any case, you don't know that you're going to translate to whatever that amounts to for 4. So just kind of a suggestion, if you are going to be estimating maxes and planning attempts based on estimated maxes, the more conservative you can be in terms of number of repetitions you're estimating from, the better off you're going to be in terms of accuracy.
So let's talk about peaking strategies and different ways to approach how to peak an athlete. Have you guys had any examples where you used a model that is maybe a little bit less conventional, something that you wouldn't normally think to do, but hey, it actually worked? And just kind of how you guys peak athletes differently on a case-by-case basis. So I'll bring up something to kind of start conversation. The best my deadlift has ever felt was 2 weeks after nationals last year, with 2 weeks of no training at all, like a 14-day cessation. Like, I was planning for it to be 1 week, and then, I kind of still didn't feel that itch to go to the gym, so I kind of just took some time off. My first session back, things were flying, and I've never felt that good on deadlift, and that was unexpected to me. I didn't expect 14 days off to elicit that kind of essentially peaking effect. So, what strategies do you guys normally use, and then how have you changed that?
I think deadlift is probably the only lift that you could get away with doing something like that. Just because if you tried to do the same thing with squat, I would bet a lot of money that it would feel pretty terrible after 2 weeks of not squatting.
Yeah.
It's interesting though. Program like Smolov that's just blasts you with volume, and then it just that cessation of training for a week. Like there is, for most people that make it through that aren't injured, there's usually a very robust increase in performance at the end of that. And so I think what's interesting to me, it's like a lot of this is going to be contingent upon how hard you were pushing heading into that period of time where you took that break.
Yeah.
And also, like you said, Eric, the lift itself. And I think with something like Smolov, it could be that we are detraining, but we're just fatigue is just so high that it's dropping to the point where we can see that increase in performance. Like perhaps the argument could be made with a more conventional, just decrease in volume. Say we drop volume 60% that final week of Smolov, could we maintain some of those adaptations, to a greater degree than if we took that week off and still manage fatigue and maybe get a better benefit from it? Like we don't know that. And so I think, for programs like that, I think for people that tend to get a lot out of just taking time off, especially with deadlift, sometimes they were just pushing it just extremely assertively heading into that period of time. And I don't know if that was the case with you, Bryce, but that's sort of what I've noticed is people that have those unconventional peaks where they take a lot of time off. Usually they have their foot assertively on the gas heading up to that point.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people are listening to this podcast, you know, a question on their mind is, well, all this stuff is great, but how do I peak? Like, how do I take this and apply it to what I'm doing? What would you guys say to that?
It really is going to depend on how you're training. So most of what we've talked about here are general principles that you can apply to any peaking cycle. But the specific examples of what we've given have been for the training style that most of us are programming, which is going to be moderate to high frequency, moderate to high volume, and well, actually probably low to moderate frequency on the deadlift, and moderate to high intensity. And that's basically how most of our programs are going to look, most of them, just because that seems to be where the evidence is pointing in terms of effective training methods. Some general rules, though, things that you can try to aim to, lose my words in the middle of a sentence. Some general ideas of things you can aim to do in your training to essentially try to be prepared on your meet. I like to aim for a little bit more than one microcycle worth of rest between the final heavy lifts and the actual competition itself. So that would mean like 7 to 8 days from the heaviest squat to the competition, 7 to 10 days for the deadlift, and something like 4 to 6 days for the bench press. And in doing that, you essentially give yourself like 2 turnovers of that microcycle, or 1.5, in order to have yourself feeling a little bit more prepared. And by the time you get to the actual competition, you get a little bit of, you know, as much as I hate the word super compensation, because I think that strength is there the whole time. You're just a little bit too fatigued to express it, but you get a little bit of what feels like that super compensation effect where you feel extra recovered. But if you were to have a conversation about this with someone like Matt Gary, for example, who's the coach for the U.S. national team, he would say something like, you know, I would much rather have someone over-recovered than under-recovered. Why gamble on under-recovery when you could just rest a couple extra days and know that you're going to be as recovered as possible? And so there's the counter argument there that, you know, you lose a little bit of that, a little bit of the skill acquisition when you deal with that. So it's a trade-off. And you know, there's people on all sides of this argument, but I think so long as you are training reasonably and you fall within some general guidelines, like what I just said, then odds on you should be reasonably ready. Optimal is a different question entirely, but without knowing more, I think those are some decent places to start.
You mentioned using singles as well as a strategy.
The place where I would use singles, I generally like them as kind of a ramp up in the course of the actual peaking block, and then something heavy towards the end of the intensity block. So in the course of a peaking block, I'll usually have someone start with multiple singles at some intensity less than an opener, a couple less at subsequent week, and then just 1 or 2 on the actual day where we're taking the openers. And then I find that a little bit of practice with singles prior to the meet helps with preparedness. And obviously there are some people who don't respond well to singles, and there are some people that respond well to singles all the time. But I find that using them less than more is generally ideal, just because structurally, mentally, and they're very demanding. And the injury risk when you're talking with heavy single rep sets tends to be a lot higher. And so I prefer to avoid them when possible.
Yeah, I think it's important just to be self-aware, to learn how to use auto-regulation for yourself, learn how to rate your RPs relatively accurately for yourself, and then implementing that in your own training. And I kind of wanted to go back to what Brian was talking about with Smolov, because I've ran Smolov quite a few times myself, just kind of experimenting on myself. And I found that I actually felt the strongest in the 3rd week, especially towards the last couple of days, the heavier days there. Rather than the testing day where, so if you're not familiar with the Smolov based mesocycle, it's basically 3 weeks of ramping up to very high volumes and intensities and then a week off prior to testing. I found that I felt the strongest towards the end of that 3rd week. So basically halfway through the cycle, somewhere around the middle of the 2nd week, you start to feel like you're starting to make adaptations to those imposed demands. And then by the end of the 3rd week, I actually felt the strongest on those heaviest days. So I experimented a few times with it and actually tested on that last heavier day in the 3rd week, and it ended up going better than it did with an entire week off. And like Brian said, it's possible if you changed the way that that cycle tapers, maybe you keep your frequency the same, but just do a big drop off in volume in that last week, maybe it would be even better. But again, I think it's just a matter of being self-aware with how you're feeling throughout a training cycle and making adjustments along the way.
So Eric, you can actually. Oh, Brian, go ahead, man.
Oh, well, if you want to finish his, go ahead, and then I'll sort of, because I want to branch off into something.
Okay, cool.
Sort of applicable.
So Eric, you can take us, start us off on this. I've got essentially three categories that I want to consider. Like, how do these things affect the peaking and tapering model? Gender differences, so male, female. Age differences, if you have a young athlete versus an old athlete, and then Wilks differences. So if you have novice to intermediates or extremely elite athletes, do any of those considerations change the overall peaking and tapering model?
Yeah, I think they certainly do, but it might not be as vague as just saying gender, because even male versus female, there's going to be differences there as far as how you're going to peak a certain one. So sometimes the smaller female lifters can do really well with higher intensity and higher frequency very close to the meet, but there's other situations where you don't want to do that. And then the same thing for the age differences. I work with a handful of masters lifters, and for some of them, we're going to take their heavier lifts a little bit farther out and have them kind of peaked a little bit longer, so maybe a longer time where their volume is lower, so they can start actually feeling pretty good going into the meet. But it's not always the case.
And then Wilks, so elite lifters versus novice intermediates.
What do you mean by that?
Like, do you peak athletes with a 500 Wilks differently than a 350?
Yeah, but it's mostly just because their training itself is going to be different. It's not necessarily because of their skill level inherently. It's just because usually with a higher level lifter, they're handling more overall training volume, and their peak is just going to look a little bit different because of that.
Got it.
It's going to be, I think, mostly determined by the style of their training. So you look at someone like a good example of a very high level female lifter like Katie Ann Rutherford. She's going to be training heavily a lot, all the time, with a pretty high amount of volume. It's like high intensity, high volume, high frequency training. Really the big three of how you can possibly make your training hardest. And Katie is immensely strong. For reference, if you don't know who she is, she weighs under 160 pounds and has squatted over 400 in the gym. And just observationally, the carryover in terms of, I think with her style of training, her peak tends to probably be a little bit shorter, because if you actually watch her training in the week of the meet, it's just a very, very quick taper on volume is what it seems to be. And she just seems to turn around and jump right back into the meet and be moving things around pretty well. Whereas other people will take a longer taper. I mean, gender differences, I think, are more accounted for the fact that there's body weight differences and relative max differences inherent with the differences in females. So an elite 160-pound male versus an elite 160-pound female, you're talking about a difference of 600 or 700 pounds on the total. And they're both elite lifters for their gender and their body weight. Mm-hmm. But essentially, just the general structural demand of their training is going to be different. And there's a lot to be accounted for there. So on the very far end of the spectrum, you look at someone like Ray Williams, and his training is, at least by our standards, very low volume, very low frequency. But the actual, and when I say volume, I'm talking number of lifts, and the actual stimulus he gets from the 3 to 5 reps that he's doing at 700, 800, 900 pounds is so much higher than what we're creating doing sets with 300 or 400 on males, or somewhere in the 200s or the 100s or the 300s on the strong females. And inherent with that, his peak is going to look a little bit different. I wouldn't be surprised to hear that he takes 7 or 10 days off before a meet.
Let me.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, go ahead, Ryan. Now
I was just going to say. I think when a lot of people think about peaking and just managing volume, it's important to realize that, like what Hani said was, you have an elite 160-pound lifter, it's a female versus a male, and the male might have, a few hundred pounds on that total, or 6 or 7, whatever your example was. Realize, like, the same protocol for both of them is going to create a lot of different amounts of stress systemically. So like with Ray, it's like each, a 3 set of 10 for him, which I've never seen him do that. but like, that would like the total homeostatic disruption, something like that is going to be immensely more than it would be for a 160-pound female. So even though all things are equal, like in terms of protocol, we're looking at bringing down the imposed stress for that level of the athlete rather than the volume per se. Like the volume is just a vehicle for us to somehow. But increasing volume, like over time, that concept, like we want to increase imposed stress over time for adaptation. And so you get to somebody like Ray, it's like he might not be doing that many sets. Like you said, Hani, like his training is notoriously pretty low volume, but it's still very high stress. And so that's something to sort of realize that like what we're actually looking at is the imposed stress versus the volume per se.
Let me stop and ask you guys a more general question here. In a basic linear periodization model, we've got a reduction in volume over weeks, and we've got an increase in intensity over weeks. Like think 3 sets of 10, 9, 8, 7, blah, 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 all the way down to whatever, and a subsequent increase in intensity. Isn't that a taper itself? And have you guys ever just not tapered someone directly for a competition and just stuck with a linear progression?
Yes, absolutely. And this is, and obviously this is highly independent, or rather highly dependent on the experience level of the lifter. If you have someone who's making a tremendous amount of progress very fast, they don't even really need to taper. So, someone who comes to mind who in the last 12 months has made a huge amount of progress is someone like Chance Mitchell, training with Eric. He just, the guy his numbers didn't stop going up for the course of like 12 months. And so for him, and with the amount of volume he was doing, which behind the scenes, a lot of you don't know, but it was probably more volume than I've ever seen anyone do ever. It's that's no joke. We're talking what, like 9 or 10 sets multiple days a week, Eric?
Depends on the lift, but yeah,
give or take, on the high end. And so, and again, this isn't a criticism. Obviously, it worked, but for someone like him, his numbers just kept going up with that volume. So there isn't necessarily a need to taper off. And if you are, you would pick and choose the meets that are going to be more important for you, because you're going to sacrifice 1 to 3 weeks of effective training by tapering it off. And for a guy who's making progress at that rate, they're essentially turning over progress on a weekly basis, like a novice. Chance was making progress like a rank novice last year, and that was honestly just amazing. He was just sucking up that volume. And so to taper off, I think is in that case not only non-essential, but probably ill-advised. And so if you're making progress quickly, you may not even feel the need to taper off a whole bunch. You might just take a couple extra days off before the meet. Whereas if you have found that you absolutely have to beat yourself into the ground with your training to add 5 pounds to your PR, then you want to have probably some productive and good feeling training sessions in the week or 2 leading up to the meet. So an earlier and slightly more aggressive taper might be better for you.
Yeah, I think just one tool that I think people can use in a situation like that where they're adapting at such a rapid rate is like if we're increasing our absolute intensity. So the load on the bar is increasing across a block that's structured in a linear manner. But if their relative intensity, like their reported RPEs they're not climbing alongside that absolute intensity, there's really no reason we want to taper. Like that just shows that we're positively adapting, and we're not really accruing fatigue to the degree that if we started at a 6, now we're at an 8 RPE in week 3. If absolute intensity is going up in relative intensity, like those initial set RPEs are sort of staying constant, or final RPEs are staying constant, like that's a good indication that we probably can keep pushing things versus taking a more assertive decrease in training volume for a taper.
Right. I think if you're in a peaking block and you're doing, singles from week to week, and let's say they're getting heavier each week, but also getting faster, or at least staying the same speed, you can't really expect that to be much better by doing a lot less in a meet week. So if you do a huge reduction in volume, or a cessation of training, you might actually do more harm than good in a situation like that, where training has been getting progressively better from week to week, and then suddenly you just do a lot less. You're actually more likely to get some detraining effects from that, and training decay, just from doing so much less than what you've been adapting to.
Sweet.
I think one thing that's interesting, just to use Chance as an example, is somebody as strong as he is, because oftentimes you see that scenario with more, I guess, novice lifters that are just experiencing these rapid adaptations. And for Chance, I mean, he's an elite level lifter that's still experiencing the progression, I guess. So it's interesting in that nothing's black and white in that regard, because, you know, I guess it's more rare to see that occurrence with an athlete of his caliber versus like a novice. But it's awesome.
So let me ask you guys kind of one final question here as we wrap up a little bit. One of the big pieces we talked about, and possibly glazed over, although Eric summed over the points very well, is the research side of things. And the other side, in terms of effective practices, is experience. You know, our experiences coaching a variety of different athletes in different ages. What have you guys learned from experience in peaking that maybe the research doesn't say, or maybe is some trick or tip that you guys picked up along the way that made for a better experience for athletes? Maybe it worked for one athlete or all athletes, or whatever the case may be.
Just to provide some context, one of the reasons that the research is kind of limited as far as peaking and taper strategies is that a lot of the studies that are involved with maximizing strength don't actually use the competition lifts. So some of the more recent ones use things like a counter movement jump or isometric bench press. And while it's interesting to see the outcomes from those, you know, they'll do a 4-week study with those movements and then, you know, do different taper strategies off of that. It's interesting to see the outcomes of that, but then again, the competition lifts are much more, there's a bigger skill demand for those. So, you know, something like a squat is a more complex skill than something like just a jump or an isometric bench press machine. So it's hard to extrapolate information from those and directly apply it to powerlifting practice.
I'm sure
So
the
what we're
fatigue
trying to
is a
say,
lot higher too.
Yeah.
Something we're trying to say here is, if you live near a university that has a researcher that's doing research on powerlifting, go and give that person a hug, because we really love studies that are directly applicable to the barbell sport. And you know, there's a handful, just a small handful of researchers out there who are actually studying the powerlifting component very specifically. Someone like Dr. Mike Zordos at FAU, his lab is literally 3 competition ER racks, several sets of competition discs, and the man literally does research on himself and on his students. And I think it's awesome, like truly awesome. And so, if you're considering getting into the field, or if you know someone who is, encourage them to divert all of their efforts to us. Not really, but we're grateful. We do enjoy that.
So, tips, anything you guys have picked up that has worked really well, something you tried on a whim, but it's been very successful?
Are you asking us for the keys right now?
Give him the keys, man. Give him the keys.
I think for, in terms of just like a takeaway strategy that I've used that works most of the time, and this is more speaking like the last couple weeks before me, not necessarily like a linear block, like an intensity block prior to this. But, you know, as Eric said, like the research seems to indicate keeping intensity intact or increasing it and scaling back on volume seems to be more advantageous. Now, like absolute intensity and volume are both going to contribute to fatigue. And so you can increase, like I might do like say your last week is a 4x4 at 80%. The next week I might do 4 sets of 2 at 80%. Mm-hmm. The next week 4 sets of 1 at 80%. And so it's a progressive taper. Absolute intensity is intact, but what's happening is that relative intensity is decreasing week to week along with the volume. And I think that's one way to do it, because I think a lot of people, when they first hear like keep intensity intact, that's just mostly referring to the absolute intensity. Like, you can do less reps with that weight, and it's going to help you still maintain that skill set under that load, but it's going to be much less stressful than pushing it to a higher RPE for that set. So just something to keep in mind, just the difference between relative intensity and absolute intensity. If you're going to keep absolute intensity intact, it's, in my experience, a good idea to scale back relative intensity along with the volume to bring down that fatigue for the tapering process.
Sweet. Eric, since we're talking about tapering and peaking kind of together, can you finish us off by talking about the difference between stepwise and exponential tapers and what you found to be effective?
It's basically just how you pull away on volume. So a step taper might be pulling away a certain percentage of your volume from week to week. So there's a lot of different ways to go about it, and I think, like Brian said, there's even just reducing your relative intensity can be a way of reducing fatigue. So not even really considering volume. So like if you did a 4x3 1 week, or 3 sets of 4 1 week, and then 4 sets of 3 the week after that, your relative intensity is a little bit lower in the week after that, but your volume is actually the same. So that session might be a little bit easier to recover from, even though your intensity and your volume is exactly the same. Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting way to think about it as well. So there's a lot of different ways that we can go about reducing volume, and I think it can be safe to do it more on a week-to-week basis based on how you're feeling. So if you're in more of a singles testing type of phase and they're starting to feel pretty rough, maybe you pull away a little bit more volume than you had planned, but it's something that you kind of have to experiment a little bit on yourself.
Cool. So take homes, be self-aware, like Eric said, reduction in volume, maintaining or slight increase in intensity, maintaining frequency as well, possibly utilizing singles or some other way to assess what you'll be capable of doing on the platform, being mindful of your own training style and fitting a peaking style in to suit that. So please don't take the peak from some famous athlete that you know of, because the volume that they peaked from could be massively different from what you're doing, and assess afterwards how it went and try to refine as you go forward.
Most definitely. I think those are actually a great list of takeaways, with the individual differences probably being the most important. Everyone is going to be a little different. There, like anything else, there's general guidelines that apply to most, but there are always exceptions to the rule. In any standard deviation, there are radical outliers on both sides. All that being said, I think we're going to bring the episode to a wrap here. I am Hani, and that's at Hani_TSA. We've got Brian Miner at BD Miner on Instagram, Eric at Eric_TSA, and Bryce at Bryce_TSA. Thank you for joining us. One more big thanks to our sponsor, LBD Fitness, at www.lbdfitness.com. And you can look forward to our next episode within the next couple weeks. We're going to bring on a sports psychologist and talk about some fun things. So if you want to leave any interesting questions you may have in the comments, if you're watching this on YouTube, that would be awesome. If you're listening to this in the podcasts app, please be sure to leave us a 5-star rating. Those really do help us to make our podcast both more visible and more accessible for people. So with that being said, thanks for listening, and that's all.
Take care, guys.